Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Islamophobia in the West has made headlines repeatedly. Pakistan, among other Muslim-majority countries, has strongly protested. But on the other side of the globe, lakhs of Muslims are being further pushed to the margins. Xinjiang in China is home to the Uyghur Muslim people. The region has witnessed increasing violence in the last decade. The Chinese state's grip has tightened. From barring Ramadan fasting to banning veils and beards, rules have become arbitrary and anti-Muslim. While Beijing's best friend Islamabad turns a blind eye to this, will the rest of the world remain a mute spectator too? On Gravitas tonight, we take you to the other side of what the Chinese government now calls the Great Wall of Iron. The headlines first. The high-profile public trial into allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election kicks off in Washington, D.C. President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is among the 20 people to be questioned in the course of the trial. France joins Germany in saying no to a separate trade deal with London. The French president warns of difficult days ahead as England's isolation over Brexit grows. Over 5 million Syrians have become refugees since conflict began in 2011, according to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, making it amongst the biggest human displacements since the Second World War. Ending a bitter feud with North Korea, Malaysian Prime Minister says the body of the assassinated half-brother of North Korea's leader will be sent to Pyongyang. The first decade of the 20th century was officially the most depressing, according to the World Health Organization. Cases of depression ballooned by almost 20% in just the past 10 years, making the disorder the leading cause of disability worldwide. China appears to be tightening its control over the Muslim-majority province of Xinjiang. Recent strictures ban face veils and long beards, among other things. We have with us this evening a very special panel. Debashish Chaudhary, Institute of Chinese Studies, is joining us here in the studio. Nouri A. Turkel, he is chairman of the board of Uyghur Human Rights Project, and with us from Munich, Einar Tangen, political and economic commentator from Beijing. Good evening to all of you. Einar, let me come to you first. A few years back, I have this report, a man was jailed for 6 years for sporting a beard. Now the draconian rule has been extended to the entire province. How does Beijing explain this?
Well, quite frankly, I mean, there's a lot of pressure in a historical point of view, for the government to take control of the situation. What they've had in the last few months is an uptick in extremist violence. On one side, you've had deaths, people being stabbed to death randomly, civilians. On the other hand, you've heard disturbing pictures of children being trained by IS, shouting that they will go back to their homeland in Xinjiang and cause rivers of blood. There's concern about how people are being led in this kind of situation.
Dr. Turkel, China calls the Uyghurs Islamist terrorists. There is a lot of radicalization, says the government in Beijing. How do you respond, sir?
Without looking at what the policy has been and what drove, if at all, Uyghurs to that kind of resentment level, we must have to look at the Chinese government's motivation and a little historic overview. The Chinese government has implemented forced assimilation policies since the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly since 9/11. The Chinese government has effectively and opportunistically used U.S.-led war on a global war on terror to legitimize its political oppression of the Uyghur people. They have done three things since then. One, strengthen the local security apparatus and two, try to selectively improve some Uyghurs' livelihood, give them some economic opportunities, and three, weaken Uyghurs' distinct ethnic identity and religious beliefs. That affected the large chunk of the Uyghur population. The Uyghur population heavily depend on the traditional religious values and cultural values, and the very attack on the Chinese government's attack of the very existence of Uyghur livelihood created enormous level of resentment against the Chinese government. Chinese government made number of legislative initiatives to legitimize its oppression, even though the Chinese constitution and Chinese laws and propaganda materials guarantees all the grievances being expressed by the Uyghur people. That includes freedom to worship. The Chinese government defines what is legal for them. So anything that the Uyghurs does not follow or don't follow, deemed to be illegal and subject to a severe punishment. Some of those punishments include death penalty and life in imprisonment.
Einar Tangen, do you want to respond to these charges? The Chinese government has been selective?
Yes, well, let me explain it this way. If you have a government that is not able to protect its people, it has failed. And in this particular case, you have a situation where the Chinese government, as the colleague has pointed out, has tried all sorts of economic incentives. They have tried repression, especially in the past, and they're at their wits' end. Instead of getting positive responses, all right, there have been very negative ones. Now, let me separate some of the issues. First off, this is not against all Uyghurs. This is against a small sect of Uyghurs who are Islamic radicals, who adhere to this kind of Eastern Turkic belief that they should be separated and are willing to use violence in pursuit of that. This is a terrorist group. I don't know why anybody would have any sympathy. The difficult part here is that Uyghurs who are not part of this are being unfairly tarred with the same brush. And those are the people that we should have sympathy for. But it'll behoove them to make sure that these separatists, these terrorists, are pointed out and removed from their society. Otherwise, there can be no solution.
That is fine, but it's not just a section of the Uyghur Muslim population that is being told to not fast during Ramadan, not sport a beard. These rules apply to everyone. So essentially, the government is not making the distinction that you are talking about. But let me take this to someone who has.
Wait a second. Let me respond to that just
Sure.
briefly.
Sure.
The people who were told not to fast were those people who had joined the party and the government. Ordinary people are allowed to continue observing their religious views. The government thought that people who had decided to serve the government could not take out special time or pursue special specific interests that were not shared by all. So please make sure that it's clear that this is not aimed at everybody. It does not apply to everybody. Yes, with the radical beard, things like this, I quite frankly don't understand what it means, and quite frankly don't understand how it will be enforced. But at some point, the government feels that it must act, and if it does not, the populace will see them as ineffective.
Right. The truth, as always, I believe, lies somewhere in between. Debashish, you have studied this region. You have, for many, many years, followed what is happening in China. Who do you think is at fault?
See, problem as far as any ethno-national movement is that sometimes we generalize and sometimes we exaggerate, and we exaggerate too much. And sometimes that is in the part of Chinese government, in the part of Uyghur exile activists, because this is a thing when we see that every Uyghur, we generalize and say that Uyghurs are making something, Uyghur separatism, Uyghur-led movement, so that Uyghur we have to see who are these Uyghur. And another thing is, when we are talking about Xinjiang independence, we have to see that Xinjiang is a huge landmass. And in that huge territory, it is 1/6 of China, and problem is not everywhere. And Uyghurs are also concentrated in limited areas. So in that case, when we are talking about this Xinjiang problem, we should be very careful about that we are not exaggerating the situation inside Xinjiang and the capability of these people to assault Chinese sovereignty. And I think there is no need of seeing that this is a huge problem and China cannot tackle it.
Okay, China cannot tackle it, but we know that in the 2009 riots, the Chinese official figures said that 200 people had died, 1,700 were injured, and these are official figures. There is no way of independently verifying what the number is, because the government control is so tight in this region. But China appears to be tightening this control further over the Muslim majority province of Xinjiang, and recent strictures, as we said, include these rules to ban beards and veils. We have this report for you.
A video purportedly released by the Islamic State last month promised that rivers of blood would flow in China as retaliation for what it claimed was the oppression of ethnic Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. China's latest strictures could well add fuel to the simmering Uyghur resentment. Veils and abnormal beards are banned. Nikah is not allowed, only civil secular marriages. Families must observe family planning. Children must attend secular state schools. The rules come into effect from April 1st. It is hard to gauge public reactions as China suppresses dissent and restricts access to Xinjiang. But various reports do suggest steadily rising levels of violence in the province. Human rights groups say 700 people have died in political violence in 2013-2014. In September 2015, 50 people were reportedly killed in knife attacks in Aksu, southwest of the capital Urumqi. Police retaliation resulted in the killing of 28 Uyghur militants 2 months later. China has demanded that the world recognize its fight against what it describes as Islamist terrorism in Xinjiang. But so far, it seems only iron brother Pakistan is supportive. The irony is, China has in the past accused Pakistan-based Islamists of supporting Uyghur terrorism. Bureau Report, WION.
Dr. Turkil, let me take this forward. Is it ironic, according to you, that Pakistan, which often decries the perceived mistreatment of minority communities, including Muslims in India, hasn't uttered a single word in protest about what is happening to the Muslim population in China?
Yeah, I'd like to address that question with what a previous speaker said. The Uyghurs are easy target, has become easy target, a politically expedient talking points for the Chinese and some of China's allies. And when you listen to them, when you listen to some of the Muslim countries, they echo each other's statement. The Muslim countries, including Pakistan and the others in the Middle East, have a horrible track record of supporting the Chinese or helping Chinese to suppress Uyghurs' religious freedom. Pakistan particularly have a horrible track record of deporting individuals who even seeking international humanitarian assistance. So as previous speaker pointed out, lumping all the Uyghurs together and putting them in the same basket as some unpopular cause makes no sense. It fails to logic. And also the previous speaker, I need to challenge him. Why would he believe in everything that he says about the Uyghurs while being skeptical about the Chinese statement in general? Is that because the Uyghurs happen to be Muslim, and is that because it's easy targets for them? Is that because you have such a tremendous confidence and trust in Chinese government propaganda? It makes no sense. He pointed out that selective Muslim practice. if you're under 18, if you're a woman, if you're even pension, a retired government or state employee, you cannot attend any particular, any type of religious activities, including funerals. The gentleman sounds like an American. Can you imagine a United States government, let's say Donald Trump, bans Muslims, Jews, and Christians observing their religious practice on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays? Impossible. There will be revolt against. Are you going to go knocking down the Jews residents or Christians to punish them because they observe Christmas? Makes no sense. You have to look at it, what is causing this resentment. Without looking at before the fact, you cannot talk about what is happening today.
Einar Tangen, I'm assuming this is for you.
Well, as a matter of fact, I am an American. So I don't know if I sound like an American, but if that's your thing, say correct. If Donald Trump did say that, there would be. But you're talking about different countries. In your country, we could address issues about radicals and the treatment of Muslims there too. But let us concentrate on the issue at hand, which is that you have a group, as the report said, where 50 people were knifed to death and 28, subsequently, 28, what he referred to as separatists were killed. They were not separatists, they were terrorists. You know, when you go and you kill people brutally with knives in an organized fashion, that is an act of terror. That is not an act of separatism. So I don't know where people get off defending these types of acts. We are not talking about the majority of Uyghurs. We are talking about those Uyghurs who have decided to go over to a radical terrorist belief. Now, in terms of the actions taken by the government, the reason they're doing this is one of the biggest issues that's happening in Xinjiang is a lack of fairness between Uyghurs and Han. Many Han have moved into the areas. The Han know how to speak standard Pudong, standard Chinese. Unfortunately, the Uyghurs do not always know how to do that, or write it, or be able to read it. So in that particular case, they are not able to get jobs. The economic opportunities are extremely limited if the only book you have ever read is the Quran. Now, saying that that is their right, but then saying that it is their right to complain what they deem an oppressive government makes no sense. The Chinese government has made efforts, sometimes not the best, to try to solve the situation. Tremendous amount of investment has been made, a number of policies to spread things. The entire Silk Road depends on being able to use Xinjiang. So this is not a situation where an oppressed minority is being pushed aside for the interests of everybody else. It is simply, how do you keep control over a very small group of people who are hiding within another group and using that as cover for their terrorist activities?
Well, perhaps imposing diktats is not the solution, and may I suggest that China might look to India for some inspiration, how minorities are treated in India and the kind of rights, despite the problems that are there. When you live in large societies, yes, there is a section of people who break the law, but to punish the entire community for that isn't something that anyone would appreciate. But having said that, Dr. Turkil, you would agree that there have been problems in this region. There have been bomb blasts, there have been suicide attacks, there's been violence. Isn't a government justified, sir, in dealing with something like this in a firm manner?
Yes, let me make this very clear to the gentleman. I'm also an American, and let me make this absolutely clear. My organization is supported by the U.S. Congress indirectly. We not only not condone any type of violence, but condemn in the strongest term anything committed against the civilians. But let me remind my fellow American who is also making similar type of points that the Chinese is making. Just days after 9/11, after the United States, my country is being attacked, George Bush went to the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. and showed solidarity with the Muslim people. He did not go around or knock my door or other Muslims' door to round them up and lock them up, and some of them being shot on the spot, which is what the Chinese do. So making that kind of false Equivalency makes no sense. It fails the logic.
Einar, Tangen, I'm curious. What is the popular reaction in China? It's hard to gauge from afar, and given the kind of censorship that exists, how do people see the situation in Xinjiang?
Well, quite frankly, if you ask the man in the street, they want action. They do not want to be put in fear. And quite frankly, Chinese cities are much safer than their American or even European counterparts. People can walk around at any time of the day or night without fear of being molested or robbed or anything like that. Not that there isn't any crime, but it is not as widespread as other places. There's a premium that is placed on safety, and the government is held responsible if they cannot do that. It is seen as a fundamental failure of the government to lose control over the safety situation. And in Xinjiang, this is what you have. I'm not quite certain about my colleagues' ideas about people being rounded up and shot on the spot. Perhaps he would care to share that evidence with the world and perhaps the International Criminal Court. Until that time comes, I think it's best to leave speculation aside and look at the issues as they are.
Dr. Turkil, why do you think the international community hasn't really taken up the matter, hasn't been very vociferous in its support for your cause, if this indeed is a case of a state repressing a certain section of society?
For the precise reason that my colleague was pointing out, taking what the Chinese said at face value, and caving into the Chinese, the economic relationship with the Chinese. Even the United States government issued a report a couple years ago on counterterrorism issue, specifically said, only one on the evidence, specifically said China's harsh treatment of Uyghurs in religious and cultural spheres have created what can be seen as a result or reason for the growing violence in the region. You have to look at what is causing it. Keep talking about how people showing their anger, it will not resolve anything. And my colleague also asked if the shooting on the spot policy. The Chinese, after the bloody crackdown of the July 5 Rimchi unrest, Chinese brought in a believed to be a moderate Chinese communist leader, Jiang Junshan, to the region. As soon as he arrived, one of the things he did, arming traffic police and using violent tactics to handle resentments. And he come up with this idea, let me say it in Chinese, 就地惩罚, that means punishment on the spot. In the past, when the Chinese rounded up political activists or religious leaders, the international human rights organizations followed up and criticized, published reports. They do know what kind of international outcry it will cause. They're doing it quietly, taking care of it on the spot. And you also, my colleague, please listen, Chinese is not going to be able, no one is going to take them to the international courts. They're signatory to a convention against torture since 1980s. They're not doing anything in accordance with the international law or that of their international obligations. So it makes no sense, again, expecting Chinese to either fulfill their international obligation or play the game with the rule.
Right.
They don't for the Chinese, Uyghurs are a problem. You have to understand that the Chinese see the Uyghurs as a national security threat simply because the Chinese worried eventually this distinct ethnic group, just like the Tibetans, because of their cultural, because of the religious background, because of the large chunk of land that they're occupying as a homeland, the Chinese believe that the Uyghurs will eventually demand political freedom. So they're taking a preventive measure, mistakenly believe that it will solve the problem. But it is creating long-term instability, ethnic hatred, and the future Chinese people, Uyghur people, and Chinese leaders have to deal with it.
Okay.
The rhetoric,
okay. Before I wrap this, Einar, I have to ask you this question. Is Beijing trying, for appearance's sake, to look fair in its treatment of what it calls a domestic problem? Does it even care how the world sees it?
No, I think Beijing does care, and they're at a very crucial part in history where, because of U.S. actions and withdrawal from the world stage, a very different attitude, they feel that they are being almost thrust into the spotlight. So yes, Beijing does care. If there were other ways of handling it, or if they could think of better ways, I think they would try. But they're at their wits' end. And as I said, they're under enormous public pressure to handle the situation. If you are a Chinese official and you're not able to handle the situation, even if it's not necessarily your fault, you will be held accountable, and that will be the end of your career. So although I've heard a long string of unfounded accusations against China, until there's something brought to light and you have a real trial and a real understanding of the situation, I think it's fallacious to be saying that you're not looking at the underlying causes. The idea of lumping all Uyghurs together with those who condone and act in violence is repugnant. And I think it's repugnant to not only the Uyghurs who are suffering under this, but also to the rest of the world.
Well, and there is going to be a lot of left to conjecture, because China doesn't allow the free press to go and report from these areas, or the scope for that is very, very limited. And at the same time, the Islamic State has turned its focus on Xinjiang. So is this going to snowball into a larger problem, a larger issue for China and the world? We'll have to wait and see. Let me thank Debashish Chaudhary very much, Nouri Turkil and Einar Tangen for joining us this evening on Gravitas. We're taking a very short break. Up next, another story, another discussion. Please stay with us.